All right, so today we are diving into something huge. The incredibly long, kind of bumpy, and honestly, pretty dramatic road to creating a single currency for Europe. And trust me, it's a wild story of big dreams, some, well, spectacular failures, and finally learning from those mistakes, one step at a time.
I mean, just think about it for a second. How on earth do you convince countries that have been rivals for centuries, each with their own history, their own proud currency, their own way of doing things, to just, give it all up and share one single currency? It sounds almost impossible, right? Well, that's exactly the question we're going to tackle.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We're in the years after World War II, and the big dream on everyone's mind is stability. See, the entire global money system was basically run by the US dollar because of the Bretton Woods agreements. And Europe? Well, Europe was looking at this and thinking, hey, we need to build our own zone of stability here.
But here's the thing. Wanting stability and actually having a plan to get it, totally different ballgames. If you look at the original Treaty of Rome, the founding document for what would eventually become the EU, it's surprisingly vague about all this money stuff. It had this big, beautiful vision for unity, for sure, but a real concrete blueprint for a single currency? Nope, not there.
So what did they agree on? Well, the initial goals were more like guiding principles. Things like, hey, let's all try to keep our balance of payments in check. Let's let money move freely between our countries. And if someone gets into trouble, we should help them out.
Oh, and they created a committee to talk about it all. Notice what's missing?
Yeah, there was still no mention of a single currency. It was all about cooperation, not yet union.
All right, so after all that talk, they finally decided to make a real go of it. The first serious attempt at a monetary union was huge. And, well, the rocky road started pretty much right away. So picture this. It's March 22nd, 1971, and the original 6 member states roll out this incredibly ambitious plan. The idea was to basically shrink the wiggle room between their currencies' exchange rates and force their central banks to start working together. This was it, the very first concrete step towards a real economic and monetary union.
And then everything just fell apart. And I mean fast. The plan gets adopted in March. Just 2 months later, in May, Germany basically says we're out, at least for now, and lets its currency, the Deutschmark, float freely because of their own economic problems. Then boom, August hits and we get the Nixon shock. The US completely upends the global system by cutting the dollar's link to gold. Absolute chaos. By the end of the year, the whole beautiful plan was just rubble.
Yeah, the whole thing was just completely overwhelmed. The source material says it perfectly. The plan's goals were abandoned under the pressure of the international environment. I mean, how could they not be? Europe's ambition was big, but it just wasn't a match for the sheer power of the US dollar. At least, not yet.
But you gotta hand it to them. Europe didn't give up. That spectacular failure in 1971 actually led to a much more creative and, way more complicated second attempt. And it had a fantastic name, the Monetary Serpent.
So what was this monetary serpent? Well, it was cooked up in 1972 to fix a really specific problem. See, under the global rules at the time, European currencies had this weird disadvantage. They could bounce around against each other by up to 4.5%, but they could only move 2.25% against the US dollar. That gave the dollar a massive edge. The serpent was designed to level the playing field by forcing all the European currencies to stick together within that same tight 2.25% band.
And to help everyone wrap their heads around this, economists came up with this brilliant visual. They called it the serpent in the tunnel. The group of European currencies, all wiggling together in that tight 2.25% band, that's the serpent. But the whole group, the entire serpent, still had to stay inside the bigger, wider 4.5% global band relative to the dollar, and that was the tunnel.
And it gets even more complicated, believe it or not, because some countries, like in the Benelux region, had an even tighter agreement just between themselves. This led to one of my favorite descriptions of any financial system ever, a Benelux worm with an EC snake within Smithsonian Tunnel. I mean, come on, that's just perfect, right? It totally captures how crazy intricate this thing was.
So let's break down how this actually worked. Step 1, you cap the wiggle room between any 2 European currencies at 2.25%. Simple enough. Step 2, the whole group of currencies, the snake, has to stay inside that bigger 4.5% tunnel against the dollar. And here's the most important part. Step 3, for the first time, central banks were required to jump into the markets, buying and selling their currencies to make sure these limits were never broken.
But, and you can probably see where this is going, just like the first time around, the serpent turned out to be pretty fragile. The economic pressure on individual countries was just too intense. One by one, the big players had to drop out. First the British pound in '72, then the Italian lira a year later, and then the French franc in '74. The serpent was, well, losing its bite.
Okay, so 2 attempts, 2 failures. But from the ashes of the serpent, something much stronger, much more durable finally emerged. It was a system built directly on all that painful, hard-won experience. The European Monetary System, or the EMS for short.
Now, the real game changer with the EMS was this new tool they created called the European Currency Unit, the ECU. This thing was a massive upgrade over the old unit they used, the EU. I mean, the old EU was basically just for bookkeeping. But the new ECU, it was so much more. You could use it to settle debts between central banks. You could hold it as a reserve currency. For all intents and purposes, it was getting really close to being actual money.
So how did this ECU work? Well, think of it like a cocktail, or a basket of all the member currencies, mixed together based on how big each country's economy was. And you can see right here just how influential the German Deutschmark was. It made up over 30% of the ECU's value. After that, you had the French franc, the British pound, the Italian lira, and so on. This was a brand new kind of composite currency, one that truly reflected the combined economic power of the whole community.
And the EMS was just packed with smart new features, all designed to avoid the disasters of the past. It had a parity grid to keep exchange rates locked in, but it also had this brilliant little divergence indicator. Think of it like an early warning alarm that would go off if a currency started to wander too far from the pack. And when that alarm sounded, that country had to take action. On top of all that, and this is so important, they massively expanded the amount of credit available so countries could help each other out in a pinch.
And you know what? This new souped-up system, it actually worked. It finally created that zone of stability Europe had been chasing for decades. And that success, that stability, is what built the momentum for the final push to a full economic and monetary union.
I mean, for more than 10 years, all the way from its launch in 1979 through the 80s, the EMS actually delivered on its promise. Now, was it perfect? No, of course not. They still had to tweak things and make adjustments, but it provided that crucial ingredient they'd been missing, relative monetary stability. And that became the foundation for literally everything that followed.
But here's where the story gets really interesting. The ECU's success wasn't just some political project happening in government buildings. The private market, actual businesses and banks started to embrace it. You had a bankers association for the ECU pop up in 1985. A company started making ECU traveler's checks, and huge companies, we're talking Philips, Fiat, they started using the ECU for their own internal books. This was the ultimate proof that the idea worked in the real world.
So just how real did it get? Well, by the end of the 1980s, the amount of private bank loans and deposits all being handled in ECUs had just exploded. We're talking about a staggering 60 billion ECU.
And a number like that sends a signal you just can't ignore. This wasn't some dream being cooked up in Brussels anymore. The market was voting with its wallet. A shared European currency was already becoming a real thing on the ground, an economic reality, even before the politicians got around to signing the final papers.
And that really brings us to the final question, doesn't it? For the very first time, you had the political goals of the governments and the economic power of the free market all pulling in the exact same direction. So you have to wonder, at that point, was a single currency no longer just a maybe or a possibility, but was it actually inevitable?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are going to do something a little different. We are going to the zoo.
We are. I was under the impression we were discussing international economic law and the history of European currency.
We are. But to get there, we have to walk past the snake, we have to crawl through the tunnel, and we have to, inspect the worm.
I see where you're going with this. You're talking about the wild, and I mean really wild, evolutionary history of the euro.
Exactly. I think most of us, myself included, have this mental model of the euro, we think. One day, Europe had francs and marks and liras, and then the next day, they shook hands, signed a paper, and poof, everyone had the euro. A nice, clean, straight line.
And the reality is just, it's about as far from a straight line as you can possibly get. It was a messy, chaotic, decades-long struggle. It was an experiment that failed repeatedly before it even came close to succeeding.
That is what we're unpacking today. We're looking at a document called Consolidated Resources in International Economic Law by attorney Lorenzo U. Padilla. And honestly, the title sounds dry. It sounds like something you'd use to cure insomnia.
It does have that ring to it, doesn't it?
But the story inside, it's full of drama. It's got defections in the middle of the night, it's got massive financial panic, and it's got this incredible tension between, these strict mathematical rules and the messy political reality.
It really is an architectural thriller. I like that description. We're looking at how you build a house, a single currency, when the ground underneath you, the entire global economy, is constantly shaking.
So our mission today is to decode this. We're going to look at the snake in the tunnel. We're going to figure out what an ECU is and why you couldn't buy a sandwich with it. And we're going to break down the incredibly strict, almost punishing entrance exam that countries have to pass to even get into the Euro Club.
And we should probably start by setting the scene. Because to understand why Europe even wanted a single currency, you have to understand the world they were living in back in the 1950s.
Right. Let's go back to the Treaty of Rome. This is the 1950s, the founding document of what would eventually become the European Union. Now, I went into this expecting to find a blueprint. I thought, surely Article 1 says, we shall create a single currency.
And what did you find?
Nothing, or, well, next to nothing. The source text calls the provisions particularly succinct, which is lawyer speak for we barely write anything down.
It is. If you actually look at Articles 104 to 109 of that original treaty, it's incredibly vague. It talks about equilibrium of the balance of payments. It mentions confidence in the currency. It sets up a monetary committee. But there is absolutely no mention of a single currency. No euro, no central bank, nothing.
What? I mean, these guys were visionary. They were building a new Europe from the ashes of the war. Why leave out the money? That seems like a huge oversight.
You have to look at the context. In the 1950s and 60s, the world was running on the Bretton Woods system.
The gold standard.
Effectively, yes. The US dollar was pegged to gold. And pretty much every other major currency was pegged in turn to the dollar. So the single currency essentially already existed, and its name was the US dollar.
Ah, okay. So the Americans were providing the stability. Europe didn't need to build its own walls because the US had already built this massive fortress around the entire global economy.
That's a perfect analogy. You don't need to worry about exchange rates between the franc and the mark if they're both locked to the dollar, which is locked to gold. It was a very rigid, very predictable system.
So Europe is sitting there rebuilding after the war, and they don't need to worry about currency swings because the U.S. is handling it. It's like living in a house where the landlord pays for the security system. You don't buy your own locks.
Exactly. But then, fast forward to the late 1960s and early 1970s, the landlord starts acting strange. The security system starts malfunctioning.
The Bretton Woods system starts to wobble.
It's crumbling. The U.S. is fighting the Vietnam War, spending huge amounts of money. And the world is starting to doubt if there's enough gold in Fort Knox to back up all those dollars floating around. And this is when Europe realizes, uh-oh, we might need our own locks.
And this brings us to the first real attempt to build a European monetary identity. March 22, 1971.
Yes, the original six.
France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg.
The pioneers. They adopt a resolution, and this is the first time they really articulate the goal. An economic and monetary union, EMU.
In the timeline. They weren't messing around, were they?
Not at all. They wanted it done by the end of the 20th century, a 30-year plan.
That's ambitious. So March 1971, they have a plan, they have a resolution. They're going to create a European Fund for Monetary Cooperation. They're going to draw their exchange relations closer together. It sounds great. Everyone is holding hands, singing Kumbaya.
It was a beautiful moment, a real statement of intent, and it lasted less than 2 months.
2 months. I have had milk in my fridge that lasted longer than their first monetary union attempt. What happened?
It was a disaster. The source material calls it the violent monetary crisis of spring 1971.
Violent is a strong word for banking. What happened?
The real world collided with their paper plans. You had these massive, and I mean massive, flows of capital moving around the world speculating against currencies. The system was under incredible pressure. And the first domino to fall was Germany.
The German defection. I love that term. It sounds so dramatic.
It was, May 9, 1971. The German government looks at the markets, looks at the tidal wave of money pouring in, buying up the Deutschmark, and they basically say, we're out. We can't hold this line. They decided to let the mark float.
Okay, for the listener who isn't a Forex trader, let's clarify float. Before this, the government would say 1 mark equals X dollars, and they would spend billions fighting to keep it there. Floating means what?
Floating means you take your hands off the wheel. You let the market decide the price. If people want to buy marks, the price goes up. If they sell, it goes down. The central bank stops burning through its reserves to defend a specific number. It's a surrender to market forces, in a way.
So Germany lets go of the wheel.
Unilaterally. They did it against the opinion of their partners, especially France. And once Germany, the biggest, most powerful economy in the group, did that, the Netherlands followed almost immediately. The Dutch florin started floating too.
So the original 6 is now the original 4 plus 2 guys doing their own thing. The unity lasted a whole 7 weeks.
Basically. But the real kill shot, the final nail in the coffin for the Bretton Woods system, came from the U.S., August 15th, 1971, the Nixon shock.
This is the big one. The moment everything changes.
It is. President Nixon goes on national television and suspends the convertibility of the dollar to gold. He essentially says, that promise we made, that your dollars are as good as gold, it's over.
That must have been absolute chaos. The anchor of the entire global financial system just disappeared overnight.
It was pandemonium. The source text describes it as the collapse of the international monetary system as it had been known since World War II. This led to the Washington Accords in December 1971. They tried to patch it all up. They devalued the dollar. Gold went from $35 an ounce to $38. But more importantly for our story, they widened the margins.
The fluctuation margin.
Right. Under the old rules, currencies had to stay super tight to their value, like within 1%. Now, the IMF said, okay, things are crazy. You can wobble a bit more. They allowed currencies to fluctuate 2.25% above or below their target rate against the dollar.
So the guardrails got wider, the road got wider, the total wiggle room is now 4.5%.
Exactly. And Europe looked at this and said, this is too wide for us.
Why? I mean, a bit more flexibility sounds like a good thing.
Not if you're trying to build a common market. Imagine you're a French winemaker selling to Germany. If the franc is at the absolute bottom of that 4.5% band and the mark is at the absolute top, that's a huge, unpredictable price difference that can appear overnight. It destroys your profit margins. It makes trade a gamble.
So they needed a narrower path for themselves.
Precisely. And this is where we get the zoo. This is the birth of the snake in the tunnel.
I love this metaphor. It is so visual. But let's break it down so we are absolutely clear on who is the snake and what is the tunnel.
Okay. Imagine a tunnel. The walls of the tunnel are the new, wider limits set by the Americans and the IMF. You could be 2.25% above the dollar or 2.25% below the dollar. That is the tunnel. It has a total width of 4.5%.
Got it. The tunnel is the global system dominated by the dollar.
Correct. Now, the European community countries looked at this and said, okay, as a group, our currencies might move up or down inside this American tunnel, but between ourselves, we can't handle that much volatility. So they agreed to limit the fluctuation between any two European currencies to just 2.25% total.
So if the mark goes up 1%, the franc can't go down by more than 1.25%. They have to move together.
Exactly. They are linked. So if you were to plot their exchange rates on a graph, you'd see this thick band of European currencies, the snake undulating and wriggling together inside this wider American tunnel.
The snake moves inside the tunnel. I get it now. But the source mentions it gets even more complicated. There is a worm.
The Benelux worm.
You cannot make this stuff up.
Yeah.
It sounds like a children's book.
No, it's literally in the text. The Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, their economies are practically married. They're so deeply integrated, they looked at the snake and said, a 2.25% band, that's still too loose for us. So they agreed to keep their own currencies, the Belgian franc and the Dutch guilder, within an even tighter margin of just 1.5% of each other.
So you have a worm inside a snake, inside a tunnel.
It's a nested doll of monetary constraint, a Russian doll of economic policy.
Why go through all this trouble? I mean, it sounds like an absolute administrative nightmare. Why not just let everything float and see where it lands?
Because they were terrified of the dollar. The text is very clear on this. The primary motivation was to suppress the American advantage. The dollar was king. It was the currency of settlement, the currency of reserve. Everything was priced in dollars. Europe wanted to create a bloc that was heavy enough and stable enough that it didn't get blown around every time the U.S. economy sneezed.
It's a declaration of economic independence, in a way.
It is, a very fragile one. But declaring independence is easy. Enforcing it is the hard part.
So how did they enforce it? It's one thing to draw lines on a chart and say, don't cross this line. But if the market hates the Italian lira on a Tuesday, the lira is going to go down. How do you stop financial gravity?
You fight gravity with cash, cold, hard central bank cash. This is the concept of intervention.
Walk us through a scenario. Let's make it real.
Okay, let's say the German mark is getting too strong. It's hitting the top of the snake's skin. And at the same time, the French franc is getting too weak, hitting the bottom. To keep the snake from breaking apart, the central banks have to act simultaneously.
So the German central bank, the Bundesbank, has to weaken its own currency.
Right. It has to sell marks on the open market, increasing the supply and pushing the price down.
And the Banque de France has to do the opposite. It has to buy francs to strengthen its currency.
Exactly. They're both pushing and pulling at the same time, manipulating supply and demand to force the currencies back into the snake.
But wait a minute. If I'm the French bank and I need to buy francs, what do I buy them with? I can't buy francs with francs. That doesn't make any sense.
You've hit on the central problem. You need foreign reserves. You need something strong to buy your weak currency with. So the French bank would have to buy francs using its reserves of, say, German marks or US dollars.
So France is spending its valuable marks to prop up the francs. What if they run out of marks?
Then they're in big trouble. And this is why the system created a massive web of debts between the central banks. They had to extend reciprocal credits to each other. It was basically a system of IOUs. The Bundesbank would say, okay, France, I'll lend you a few billion of my marks so you can go buy your own currency and stay in the snake.
And these debts had to be paid back, presumably.
Oh, yes, and quickly. The settlement rules were very strict. You had to settle up within 30 days of the end of the month in which the intervention happened. So basically, you had about 45 days of credit max. After that, you have to pay up in your creditor's currency or in gold or dollars or something called SDRs, special drawing rights from the IMF.
This sounds incredibly stressful. You're constantly watching the ticker, intervening, borrowing money you don't have, paying it back next month.
It was a constant high-wire act, and they realized they needed an institution to manage all this accounting nightmare. So they created the ECOM, the European Fund for Monetary Cooperation, in April 1973. It was basically the bookkeeper for the snake.
So they built the cage, they hired a zookeeper. Did it work? Did the snake stay in its tunnel?
Well,
That's a no.
the snake was, let's say, a very fragile creature. It kept shedding its skin, or rather losing body parts.
Who defected this time?
The UK joined in 1972 and left almost immediately. The market pressure on the pound was just too high. They couldn't afford to keep it propped up. Italy left in 1973, and then France, one of the founders, left in 1974. They actually left, came back, and then left again. It was a revolving door.
So by the mid-70s, the snake is basically just Germany and a few of its small, closely tied neighbors like the Benelux countries. The worm is still there, but the snake is a shadow of its former self.
Pretty much. And to make matters worse, the tunnel collapsed.
The American tunnel?
Yes. In 1973, the US dollar stopped being fixed to anything and started freely floating. So the external walls, the global framework that the snake was supposed to live inside, just vanished. So now you just had this remnant of a snake floating in open space. The British, Italian, French defections, as the text calls them, essentially killed the dream of the 1970s.
So if we pause the story here in, say, 1978, the whole project looks like a complete and utter failure. The big countries have all left. The dollar's doing whatever it wants. The EPCOM is just managing a ghost town.
It looked bleak. It really did. But, and this is the key theme of this entire deep dive, Europe is persistent. They don't give up easily. They didn't scrap the idea. They looked at the wreckage of the snake and said, okay, that design was flawed. We need a better cage.
Enter part 3, the European Monetary System, the EMS.
This is the big reset. December 5, 1978. It was initiated by France and Germany Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. They launched the EMS. And the goal this time was slightly more modest. Create a zone of monetary stability.
And this time, they introduced a new weapon, a new concept, the ECU,
ECU.
the European Currency Unit.
Now, to be absolutely clear for the listener, because this confused me at first reading the source, the ECU is not the euro. I couldn't go to a cafe in Paris in 1980 and pay for a coffee with an ECU coin.
No, absolutely not. The ECU was not physical money. You couldn't hold it in your hand. It was an accounting unit. It was, in essence, a basket currency.
Explain the basket. What does that mean?
Okay, so instead of pinning everything to an external anchor like gold or the dollar, they created their own internal anchor. It was a sort of phantom currency, the ECU, that was made up of little bits of all the real currencies. Imagine a literal basket. Inside, you put a specific amount of Deutschmarks, a specific number of French francs, some Italian lira, a pinch of Dutch guilder.
A monetary fruit salad.
That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
And the value of one ECU on any given day was the weighted average of all the component currencies in the basket.
How was it weighted? Was everyone equal? No, not at all. It was based on the economic size of each country. The Deutschmark was the heavyweight. It made up about 30.1% of the basket's value. The French franc was next at about 19%. The British pound, even though they weren't fully participating in the exchange mechanism, was in the basket at 13%, the Italian lira about 10%, and it went all the way down to the tiny Luxembourg franc at 0.4%.
So the ECU's value represents the average health and stability of the entire European economy.
Precisely. And this became the new pivot point. In the old snake system, it felt very bilateral. It was the franc versus the mark. It was adversarial. In the EMS, every currency now had a central rate against the ECU.
The parity grid.
Right. So the French franc has a target rate against this abstract ECU, and it was allowed to wobble 2.25% up or down from that central rate.
Same wobble room as the old snake.
For most countries, yes. But they learn a crucial lesson from the snake's failure. One size does not fit all. Some economies are just more volatile, so they built in flexibility. The Italian lira, it's a famously volatile currency. The British pound, famously independent. So they give them a wider lane. Italy, Spain, the UK, they were allowed to fluctuate by 6% up or down.
Wow, that's a huge difference. That's a very, very generous wobble. It's almost not a system at that point.
It was a political compromise, and it was smart. Better to have them inside the system with loose rules than outside the system entirely, causing trouble.
But the EMS had another clever trick, something the source calls the divergence indicator. And it says this created a presumption of action. What does that mean?
This is one of the hardest pieces of engineering in the whole story. It's a genuine innovation. In the old system, you waited until a currency hit the wall at the absolute limit before you panicked and intervened. The divergence indicator was an early warning system.
The check engine light for a currency.
Exactly. They set a threshold at 75% of the maximum allowed spread. So if your currency started to drift and it hit 75% of the way toward its limit against the ECU, a bell rang in Frankfurt and Paris and Rome.
And what happened when the bell rang?
The country had to do something. It created this presumption of action. You couldn't just sit on your hands and hope it went away. The government in question was now expected to take corrective measures, raise interest rates, cut government spending, maybe intervene in the markets. It forced discipline before the crisis hit.
That's a big shift. It's proactive instead of reactive. Now, I want to zoom in on one specific legal update mentioned in the text that seems really important. The Nyborg Accord of 1987, it talks about a shift in the burden of proof.
Yes, this is a subtle but absolutely massive shift in the power dynamics of the system.
Explain that. In the old days, if I'm the weak currency, say the Italian lira, and I'm crashing, I have to go cap in hand to the Germans and beg for a loan of Deutschmarks to save myself. And the Germans can just say, 9.
Right. The power lay entirely with the creditor. The strong country, the one with the currency everyone wanted, held all the cards. They decided if the weak survived.
So how did the Nyborg Accord change that?
It essentially shifted the burden of responsibility. Under the Nyborg Accord, if a weak currency requested short-term financing for an intervention that was deemed necessary, there was a presumption that the strong currency central bank should provide it. The German bank could still say no, but now the burden was on them to publicly explain why.
That is a complete 180-degree turn. Before, I had to prove why I need the money. Now you have to prove why you won't give it to me.
Exactly. It wasn't an automatic, unlimited credit line, but it applied enormous political pressure. It made the system much more communal. It forced the strong economies to take some ownership of the stability of the weak ones. It was a huge step towards true solidarity, which is essential if you want to eventually share a single wallet.
Speaking of sharing a wallet, there is a section in the source material that really genuinely surprised me. We've been talking about the ECU as this very technical governmental tool, this abstract accounting trick. But Section 4 talks about the private life of the ECU.
This is my favorite part of the entire story, because it shows that the market is often smarter and quicker than the politicians.
The ECU escaped the lab.
It did. Remember, there were no ECU coins or banknotes, but private banks, big corporations, they started looking at this thing and realizing, hey, this basket idea is actually really useful.
Why? What was the use case?
Stability. Imagine you are a giant European company in the 1980s. Fiat, Philips, Saint-Gobain, these are all mentioned by name in the text. You are buying parts in Germany, paying in marks. You're selling cars in France, earning francs. You're paying your factory workers in Italy, in lira. You are constantly dealing with 10 different fluctuating currencies. The exchange rate risk is a daily nightmare.
Right. If the lira crashes against the mark, your Italian payroll gets cheap, but the German steel you need for your cars suddenly costs a fortune.
Exactly. But the ECU, because it's an average of all those currencies, it's naturally much more stable than any single one. It smooths out all the highs and lows. So these companies started doing their internal accounting in ECU. They started writing contracts with suppliers in ECU. They even started issuing corporate bonds denominated in ECU.
The text even mentions traveler's checks. I found that amazing.
Yes. In 1985, a group of French bankers, later joined by Italian and British banks, formed a company specifically to issue traveler's checks in ECUs.
Which is wild because you couldn't actually spend them anywhere. You'd have to go to a hotel in Spain, and the concierge would have to look at your ECU check, do a calculation, and then give you Spanish pesetas.
True. But for the traveler, it was a way to hold value that wouldn't crash overnight if one country had a crisis. It was a safe harbor. It was a bet on the stability of Europe as a whole, not just one country.
So how big did this private ECU market get? Was it just a niche thing for a few giant companies?
No, it became huge. The numbers in the text are just staggering. By 1989, there were 11.1 billion ECU worth of securities that had been issued. The market for bankers' credits and deposits in ECU was over 60 billion.
And the global ranking.
This is the kicker. The source says the ECU became the 6th most used international financial instrument in the world.
Wait, 6th? Ahead of what?
After the US dollar, the Deutschmark, the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc, and the British pound. It was bigger than the French franc, bigger than the Italian lira on the international stage.
That is absolutely incredible. A fake currency, a mathematical abstraction with no central bank, no country, and no actual coins, became the 6th most used form of money in the world.
It proves that there was a genuine bottom-up, market-driven demand for a single European currency. The private sector voted with their wallets long before the euro was officially born. They built the road that the politicians eventually decided to walk on.
So the market is ready. The EMS, despite a few crises, is holding up and has proven more resilient than the snake. The zoo is finally under control. Now comes the final push, the transition from a basket to a real currency, the Delors Plan.
Jacques Delors, the then president of the European Commission, the architect of the final phase. The plan was examined by the European Council in Madrid and Strasbourg in 1989, and it laid out a very clear 3-stage rocket to get to the moon being the final economic and monetary union, or EMU.
Let's walk through the 3 stages, because this wasn't just print the money. It was a gradual, deliberate tightening of the screws.
Stage 1 began July 1st, 1990. The headline here, the big move, is freedom of movement.
For people. We already had that, sort of.
For capital. For money. Before this, in many countries, there were still strict controls. You couldn't just wire 1 million francs from your Paris bank account to a German one without jumping through hoops. Governments controlled the flow of capital to protect their currency's value. Stage 1 said, tear down all the walls. Total liberation of capital movements.
That sounds incredibly risky. If money can leave your country instantly, a currency can crash instantly. A government loses a major tool of control.
It is risky. It's taken off the training wheels. But it was a necessary step. You can't have a truly single market if money is trapped in national silos.
Okay, so that's stage 1.
Yeah.
Then we moved to stage 2, which started on January 1st, 1994.
This is the getting ready phase. The text calls it the phase for the convergence of economic policies. They created the European Monetary Institute, the EMI, in Frankfurt.
Which sounds like the boring older uncle of the European Central Bank.
It was exactly that. It was the precursor. Its job was to strengthen the cooperation between national central banks and prepare all the technical instruments for the future single policy. The whole goal of stage 2 was to get everyone's house in order. You had to focus on price stability. You had to have sound public finances. Basically, you had to prove you were responsible enough to join the club before they gave you the keys.
And then, stage 3. The final stage.
The Big Bang, January 1st, 1999.
This is it, the point of no return.
Absolutely. On that day, the exchange rates between the participating currencies were fixed permanently, irrevocably. No more wobbling, no more 2.25% bands. The rate between the mark and the franc was locked forever. The single currency, the euro, was introduced first virtually, for banking and financial transactions.
Right. The actual cash didn't show up for another few years.
Correct. And the European Central Bank took the wheel from the national central banks. Monetary policy was no longer made in Paris or Rome. It was made in Frankfurt for everyone.
Not everyone got on the bus for this final journey.
No. 11 members participated in the start of Stage 3 in 1999. Greece, which didn't qualify at first, managed to join 2 years later in 2001, but there were notable holdouts: Denmark, Sweden, and of course the United Kingdom.
The UK staying true to form.
They looked at the project, looked at the loss of sovereignty, and said, no thanks, we'll keep the pound.
Now, I really want to talk about the entrance exam, because getting into Stage 3 wasn't automatic. You didn't just sign a form. You had to pass a very difficult test, the convergence criteria.
The Maastricht criteria, these are famous, or infamous, depending on who you ask. To join the club, to be deemed ready for Stage 3, a member state had to meet 5 very strict, very mathematical conditions.
I feel like every finance minister in Europe in the mid-90s had these numbers tattooed on the inside of their eyelids. Let's go through them one by one.
Number 1, the deficit. Your annual government deficit could not exceed 3% of your gross domestic product, your GDP.
Okay, so basically you can't overspend your annual budget by more than 3% of your entire economy's output.
Right. Number 2, the debt. Your total accumulated national debt could not exceed 60% of your GDP.
3% and 60%. These are the two golden numbers that everyone remembers.
They are, but there were 3 others that were just as important. Number 3, inflation. You couldn't just be printing money to pay your debts and faking your numbers. Your inflation rate couldn't be more than 1.5 percentage points higher than the average of the 3 best-performing member states.
So if the 3 most stable countries have 2% inflation, you can't have more than 3.5%. You have to be in the same ballpark.
Exactly. Number 4, interest rates. Your long-term government bond interest rates couldn't be more than 2 percentage points higher than the average in those same 3 low-inflation countries.
This measures market trust, right? If your interest rates are high, it means the market thinks you're a risky bet and demands more to lend you money.
Correct. And finally, number 5, the one that ties it all back to our earlier conversation, exchange rate stability. You had to have respected the normal fluctuation margins of the EMS for at least 2 years without severe tensions. Basically, you had to prove you could play nice in the sandbox for 2 years straight before they gave you the keys to the castle.
These criteria are fascinating because they are designed to ensure that the economies are structurally similar before they merge. The text says they are measures designed to ensure that economic development does not give rise to any tensions.
They wanted homogeneity. They didn't want to hitch a racehorse to a donkey and expect them to pull the cart at the same speed. The idea was to force everyone to become, more or less, a German-style economy. Low debt, low deficit, low inflation.
But here is the trillion-euro question. It's one thing to diet like crazy to fit into a wedding dress, but what happens after the wedding? What stops a country from binge eating, from spending like crazy, the day after they join the euro?
That is the fundamental flaw in the logic, isn't it? And it's what led to the euro crisis a decade later. Once you were in, you have the powerful euro credit card. The market suddenly treats Greek debt almost like German debt because it's all denominated in euros. Borrowing becomes cheap and easy. The temptation to overspend is huge.
So did the architects have a plan for that? For the post-wedding diet?
They did. They weren't naive. It's called the Stability and Growth Pact. It was adopted in Amsterdam in 1997, before the euro even launched.
The house rules.
That's a good name for it. The source calls it the mechanism to ensure budgetary discipline efforts once the single currency has been introduced. The goal is for members to aim for a balanced budget or even a surplus over the medium term. And unlike the earlier treaties, this one had teeth.
Real teeth. Or political we promise to be good teeth.
No, financial teeth. The Council of Ministers can actually penalize a member state that fails to take action to fix an excessive deficit, which is still defined by that 3% rule.
What kind of penalties are we talking about?
It starts with something called a non-interest-bearing deposit. Basically, the EU takes a chunk of your money, it could be billions of euros, and holds it hostage in an account that earns 0 interest.
That hurts, especially for a country that's already in debt.
It gets worse. If you don't correct the deficit within 2 years, that deposit is converted into an outright fine. You don't get the money back, ever.
Wow. So the system was built from the ground up with a mechanism to literally fine sovereign nations for overspending their budgets.
Yes. The legal framework is very clear on that. Now, whether the political will exists to actually enforce those fines on a large country like France or Italy, well, that is a very different story.
That's the core tension, isn't it? The law says fine them, but politics says You can't fine France. That would cause a political crisis.
Exactly. And this brings us to the final section of our deep dive today, which the source material lays out really well, the decision-making process. It's not simple. The book breaks down exactly how the EU decides these things, and it reveals just how protective nations still are of their sovereignty, even inside this union.
It's not just a simple majority vote for everything.
No way, not even close. The treaty defines different, complex voting methods for different issues. It's a carefully balanced matrix of power.
Give us some examples from the text.
Okay, take something simple, like coins. If member states want to harmonize the denominations and specifications of coins, the decision is made by a cooperation procedure. It's collaborative. It's not very controversial.
Okay, that makes sense.
But let's ramp it up. Look at exchange rate guidelines. If they want to set a general policy for the euro's exchange rate, the Council decides by a qualified majority. That means you don't need every country to agree, but you need a heavy weighted majority based on population size.
So a small country like Malta can't block the policy, but a coalition of big countries like Germany, France, and Italy can push it through.
Right. But now look at the really big one, external exchange rates. Imagine the EU wants to formally fix the rate of the euro against the US dollar or the Japanese yen, like in the old Bretton Woods system. That is a massive geopolitical move.
Who decides that?
Unanimity. Every single country has to agree.
Every single one. So if Tiny Luxembourg says no, the deal is dead.
Correct. It gives every country a veto. That sets an incredibly high bar for that kind of external monetary policy. It makes the euro a giant on the world stage, but a very slow-moving one.
What about the discipline? The fines for excessive deficits we just talked about. How is that decided?
This is the really interesting part. To decide if a country even has an excessive deficit in the first place, they use a qualified majority, but, and this is the key detail, excluding the member state concerned.
So you can't vote to save yourself. You're kicked out of the room.
Exactly. You have to leave while the others decide your fate. It's a trial by a jury of your peers, and you're not on the jury.
And finally, what about bailouts? If a country is in severe economic difficulties and needs help,
the text says that for the community to grant financial assistance, it requires unanimity in the Council. Everyone has to agree to bail you out.
that makes bailouts incredibly difficult politically. You have to convince every single neighbor, including the ones who followed the rules, to open their wallet for you.
Unless there's a loophole.
There's an exception.
There's one specific exception mentioned. If the severe difficulties are caused by natural disasters or exceptional occurrences beyond its control, if your economy is wrecked by a hurricane or an earthquake, the voting rules are easier.
That is a fascinating moral and legal distinction. A hurricane gets you easier money than a self-inflicted budget crisis.
It reflects the core philosophy of the architects in Germany and the Netherlands. They believed you are responsible for your own budget. So if you mess it up, no bailouts without a fight. But you aren't responsible for the weather.
So we have traveled this incredible road, from the vague promises of the Treaty of Rome through the failed start of 1971, the zoological experiments of the snake in the tunnel, the stability of the EMS, the brilliance of the private ECU, all the way to the rigid, mathematical, German-inspired rules of the Euro and the Stability Pact.
It is a remarkable journey. When you lay it out like that, you see they started by just trying to survive the fluctuations of the dollar. They ended up creating a currency that could actually rival it on the world stage.
What stands out to me is the sheer persistence.
Yeah.
They failed in 71. They failed to keep the snake together in the 70s. The UK left. Italy left. France left and came back. But they just kept iterating. They invented the basket concept. They invented the divergence indicator. They kept building better and better cages until they finally built a fortress.
And we can't forget the role the private sector played. The fact that businesses and banks adopted the ECU before it was even real money shows that the economic demand for stability was stronger than the political hesitation. The market was pulling the politicians along.
But looking at the whole story laid out in the source material, there is a fundamental tension that remains unresolved, isn't there?
The tension between the math and the politics, between the rules on paper and the messy reality.
Exactly. The entire system is built on this idea of convergence, the idea that all these different economies will align and act alike if you just give them strict rules, 3% deficit, 60% debt. The text is very clear on the mechanics of fines and sanctions for breaking these rules.
But as we saw with that burden of proof shift in the Nyborg Accord back in the 80s, these rules are constantly being bent and negotiated against political reality.
And that is the provocative thought I want to leave our listeners with today. We've looked at the legal framework. It's elegant. It's incredibly detailed. It has formulas and voting procedures for everything. But in a system that is designed around this concept of mathematical harmony, what happens when a political or economic crisis makes those numbers impossible to hit? The source lays out the legal tools, like the reversal of the burden of proof, where strong countries have to explain why they won't help. But does that legal obligation really hold up when a major economy, one that's too big to fail, but maybe too big to save, starts to falter?
The law provides the mechanism, but history provides the test. The snake died because the tunnel it lived in collapsed. The euro is a much stronger beast, but it's still living in a very volatile world.
It's a question of whether the architecture, as brilliant as it is, can truly withstand the earthquake when it finally comes.
Or the hurricane.
Touché. Thank you for diving into the tunnel with us today. It's been a wild ride through the history of European money.
A real pleasure to explore the zoo with you.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're performing what is basically an autopsy on a dream. We're looking at the years between 1957 and 1979, so the era between the Treaty of Rome and the launch of the European monetary system. It's the story of how Europe tried to forge a single currency while the entire global economic order was just collapsing around them.
It really is. It's a period that usually gets glossed over as, the prehistory of the euro. But where you dig into the source material, it's a bit of a crime scene. So the question we're wrestling with today is this. Was the road to the European monetary system a deliberate, evolutionary path laid out by the Founding Fathers, or was early European monetary policy just a series of, frankly, panicked reactions to the collapse of the American dollar?
Right. It's that classic tension between design and disaster. I'm going to be arguing that despite the chaos of the 70s, the drive toward union was evolutionary, that it was rooted in this idea of mutual convergence that was envisioned right there in the original treaties. I think the failures were actually necessary R&D, the prototypes, if you will, that paved the way for what came later.
And I see it very differently. I look at the archives and I just don't see a blueprint, I see a scramble. I'll be arguing that the original treaties were woefully inadequate. The text itself calls them succinct, which is a very polite way of saying empty, and that the early mechanisms like the famous monetary serpent were deeply flawed reactive measures. They weren't building blocks. They were just political wishful thinking, trying to patch up structural holes.
Well, let's get into the evidence, because to claim it was just a scramble, I think ignores the DNA of the project. We have to start at the beginning, the Treaty of Rome, 1957. Specifically, Articles 104 to 109.
The succinct articles, yes.
Brief, yes, but not empty. I mean, if you look at the text, the core ambition is already there. These articles established the Monetary Committee. They created safeguard clauses. But most importantly, they introduced the concept of mutual convergence of economic policies. The founders understood that you couldn't just have free trade. You had to align the economic heartbeats of the member states.
Okay, but aligning heartbeats is poetry, not policy. When you actually read Articles 104 through 109, they're incredibly vague about how to do that. They set up committees, sure, but they didn't create a real mechanism to bind currencies together. They just relied on this idea that everyone would sort of cooperate.
But cooperation is the first step of integration. And it became policy very quickly. Look at the Barre Plan in 1969 or the Werner Plan in 1970. The Werner Plan is absolutely crucial here. It wasn't a reaction to a crash. It was a proactive roadmap. It explicitly proposed a three-stage process to achieve full economic and monetary union. And this all culminated in the resolution of March 22nd, 1971. That resolution set a hard deadline, monetary union before the end of the 20th century. I mean, that is the definition of a deliberate, forward-looking vision.
Okay, but let's look at what actually happened to that vision. You cite the resolution of March 22nd, 1971 as this triumph of intent. But the timeline in the source material is, well, it's brutal. It states that less than 2 months after its adoption, the monetary objectives in that resolution were abandoned. 2 months.
That doesn't invalidate the intent, though. It just shows the environment was hostile.
It invalidates the execution. A plan that survives for 8 weeks isn't a plan, it's a fantasy. And why did it fail? Because this mutual convergence you talk about, it wasn't real. In May 1971, mere weeks after promising to marry their economies, what happened? The German defection.
You're referring to the floating of the mark.
Exactly.
The German government decided to let the Deutschmark float freely against the dollar, completely ignoring what the other partners thought. And then the Dutch followed suit with the florin immediately after. I mean, these are the two strongest economies in the bloc, and they broke rank at the first sign of trouble because the market pressure was too high. They prioritized their own inflation battles over European unity. That tells me the treaty's mutual convergence was a paper tiger.
But you're judging the structural integrity of a brand new building by how it handles a massive earthquake. You can't talk about the German defection without talking about the cause.
Which was inflation.
Which was being imported from the United States. And this brings us to the core context of the 1971 failure. It wasn't that the Europeans were incompetent. It was that the entire Bretton Woods system was dying. We should probably explain this because it really does change everything.
Sure, the breakdown of the gold standard.
Exactly. Since World War II, the global economy was anchored by the US dollar, which was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Every European currency was pegged to the dollar. That was the floor everyone was standing on. But by 1971, the U.S. was printing far too much money, financing the Vietnam War, social programs, and they just couldn't back it with gold anymore. The system was flooding with dollars.
Right, and Germany didn't want to import that inflation, so they stopped buying dollars and let the mark float.
Precisely. And then the hammer drops. August 15, 1971, President Nixon goes on television and suspends the convertibility of the dollar into gold, just like that. Overnight, the anchor of the entire global economy is cut loose. So my argument is that the failure of that European resolution, that 2-month lifespan you mocked, it wasn't due to internal weakness. It was because the United States unilaterally changed the laws of physics for the global economy.
I agree that Nixon's move was a hurricane, but this is exactly my point about the European system being reactive. They were completely at the mercy of Washington because they hadn't built an independent structure. They were trying to coordinate their currencies, but they were all still just satellites orbiting the dollar.
They were trying to build a European fund for monetary cooperation.
In 1971. This is the smoking gun for my argument. The Americans devalue the dollar, gold goes to $38 an ounce, and the IMF expands the fluctuation margins.
They widen the bands to 2.25%.
Right. Before this, currencies had to stay within 1% of their value. The IMF said, okay, things are crazy, let's loosen the belt. You can now fluctuate 2.25% up or down against the dollar. And what did Europe do? Did they stick to their deliberate vision? No. They abandoned their own objectives of fixity and just adopted the IMF's new, wider margins. They did exactly what Washington and the IMF told them to do. Every major change in European monetary policy in 1971 was dictated by a decision made in the White House. That's not evolution. That's just
in 72, where Europe stops just reacting and actually starts innovating.
Or starts hallucinating.
No, look at the Basel Agreement in April 1972. They looked at the Washington Accords, the tunnel of 2.25% fluctuation allowed by the U.S., and said, that is way too loose for us. If we want a common market, we can't have our currencies bouncing around that much against each other. So they created the serpent.
a very evocative name.
It is. The goal was monetary solidarity. They agreed to keep their European currencies within a much tighter band, half the size of the dollar band inside that tunnel. They were trying to create an island of stability in a chaotic ocean. They effectively said, we don't care what the dollar does on any given day. We will stay close to each other.
Island stability is a great marketing phrase, but we need to break down the math of the serpent. Because this is where the whole deliberate evolution theory just falls apart. The math proves it was a trap.
The math was designed to enforce discipline.
The math was a volatility engine. Let's actually try to visualize this, because it's the key to understanding why the 70s failed. So, okay, imagine the tunnel. That's the room the Americans gave everyone to move in. The ceiling is plus 2.25% against the dollar. The floor is minus 2.25%. That's a total spread of 4.5%.
Correct. Those are the tunnel walls.
Now the Europeans say, we'll stay closer together. They create the serpent inside that tunnel. But here's the flaw. The serpent didn't peg European currencies to each other directly. It defined their relationship based on their position against the dollar.
Well, it limited the distance between the strongest and weakest European currency at any given moment.
Right, but let's look at the worst-case scenario described in the material. This is fascinating.
Suppose you have a weak currency, let's say the Italian lira. The market is pushing it down. So the lira is at the very bottom of the allowable band against the dollar. It's scraping the floor of the tunnel. At the very same time, everyone loves the German mark, so it's at the very top, hitting the ceiling.
Okay, so they're 4.5% apart.
Exactly. Now time passes. The economic winds change. Suddenly the lira rallies and shoots all the way to the ceiling. The mark crashes and hits the floor. Both currencies are still technically inside the tunnel. They are obeying the American rules. But relative to each other, the divergence is massive. The material says the total shift between two European currencies could reach 9%.
That is the theoretical maximum, yes, if they were to swap places entirely.
Just think about what that means for a business. Say you're a German car manufacturer selling your products in Italy. You have a common market, no tariffs. But purely because of this bizarre currency mechanism, the price of your goods has swung 9%. I mean, that destroys your profit margin. That completely wipes out the benefit of free trade. The serpent actually amplified the volatility of the dollar into a wedge that drove European neighbors apart.
I will concede that the 9% divergence was a flaw, and yes, it was messy. But you're focusing on the mechanics, and you're missing the strategic value. The serpent was an experiment in coordination. For the serpent to work at all, the central banks had to talk to each other every single day. They had to intervene in each other's markets. It forced them to build the phone lines, the relationships, the protocols.
And they failed. The serpent was a revolving door. Britain joined and left in weeks. Italy left. France left, came back, and then left again. It wasn't an institution, it was a train station. You can't build a stable economy when your major partners are quitting the system every 6 months because the math doesn't work.
But that failure was educational. This is the hill I will die on regarding this history. You cannot have the success of the European monetary system, the EMS, in 1979 without the messy failure of the serpent. The source material is explicit on this. It says the EMS profited from the said experience.
Profited from experience is a nice way of saying we realized our first idea was terrible.
No, it means they learned. Look at the transition. The serpent taught them that the 2.25% margins were too rigid for some and too loose for others. It taught them that you can't just anchor to the dollar. So when they built the EMS in 1979, they created the ECU, the European Currency Unit. They created a basket of their own currencies. They built a system that was internally anchored, not externally dependent on Washington. You don't call a laboratory experiment a failure just because the test tube explodes. You take the data and you build a better compound.
See, I read that transition to 1979 very differently. The source material has a very telling line about the EMS. It says that the progress realized on monetary matters was independent of the original treaties.
In terms of mechanism, sure. The treaty didn't mention an ECU.
Independent implies they had to go off script. It says it signaled a departure from the older initiatives taken. That includes the Werner Plan, that includes the serpent. My point is that by 1979, they realized the Treaty of Rome just didn't have the answers. They effectively had to scrap the old roadmap because it led them off a cliff. The bold lines drawn at the Madrid and Strasbourg councils in 1989 were only possible because they finally stopped trying to patch up the serpent. They didn't learn from the treaty, they had to work around it.
I think working around it is a cynical way to describe improvisation. The treaty provided the goal, equilibrium. The 1971 crisis provided the test. The serpent was the prototype, and the EMS was the production model.
But look at the cost of that prototype. You mentioned the island of stability. The reality was that the serpent forced European countries to prioritize currency defense over their own domestic economies. When you're forced to raise interest rates just to keep your currency inside some meaningless tunnel defined by the US dollar, you cause unemployment, you cause recession. The political will for the euro didn't come from the success of the serpent, it came from the pure exhaustion of dealing with it.
But they stuck with it. That's the resilience. Despite the German defection, despite the Dutch defection, despite the mathematical absurdity of that 9% swing, they didn't quit. They could have just gone back to floating currencies and been a simple free trade zone.
But they didn't. They kept trying to fix the money. And why? Because those succinct words of the Treaty of Rome, mutual convergence, were stronger than the market chaos.
Because they were terrified of what would happen if they didn't. I think the driving force wasn't the treaty, it was the dollar. Every time the U.S. sneezed, Europe got pneumonia. They built the EMS not to fulfill some dream from 1957, but to finally build a wall against American volatility. It was a defensive fortification, not an evolutionary garden.
Perhaps it was both. Necessity is the mother of invention, after all. But I think if you look at the stability that followed, the 10-plus years of relative calm after 1979, it proves that the lessons were learned. The serpent died so the EMS could live.
The serpent died because it was mathematically doomed. But I will grant you this. The EMS was a much smarter beast. It finally accepted that if you want a union, you need a basket of your own currencies, not a shadow of someone else's.
And that distinction is absolutely vital. The move from the serpent to the EMS was the move from adolescence to adulthood for the European economy. They stopped looking to their parents in Washington to set the curfew and started setting their own rules.
I suppose that's one way to look at it, though I would argue they just traded one set of problems for another. But the fundamental point remains, the 1970s wasn't a straight line, it was a zigzag.
We are coming up on time, so let's try to zoom out. When we look at this 20-year period from the Treaty of Rome to the EMS, what's the takeaway? To me, it is a story of grit. The path was much, much rockier than the founders anticipated. They certainly didn't foresee the collapse of Bretton Woods. But the fact that they moved from those few paragraphs in the treaty to a fully functional system by 1979 proves that the political will for union was the constant variable.
And for me, the takeaway is caution. It's a lesson in the dangers of succinct treaties. The ambiguity of the early years left Europe completely vulnerable. They wasted a decade reacting to Nixon and the IMF because they hadn't done the hard work of defining their own system first. The serpent wasn't a stepping stone. It was a stumbling block that, frankly, they were lucky to survive.
Well, whether it was a stumble or a step, it got us there. And understanding that messy, mathematical nightmare of the 1970s is absolutely crucial to understanding why the euro is designed the way it is today. You can still see the scars of the serpent in the structure of the modern European central bank.
Absolutely. The fear of that 9% volatility is written right into the DNA of the euro. They made sure that door was closed and locked.
And that's all the time we have. Thank you for listening to the debate. We hope this gave you a clearer picture of the chaotic origins of European money.
Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.